It is one of the most controversial questions being asked of the Republican and presidential candidates. In the CBS debate, both Governor Mitt Romney and Speaker Newt Gingrich were asked if the President of the United States has the power to order the death of a U.S. citizen. Gingrich gave a lengthy legal answer, saying that many Americans are confused on the subject. Is he right? Ben has the reality check.
Well, Newt Gingrich not only answered the question in length, he did so with a swagger that indicated the answer is simple and obvious. I'm going to look at three different statements Gingrich made, but there is so much information here. We're breaking this into two parts. Tonight, part one, is Gingrich right about the specific case of Anwar al-Awlaki? Let's begin with who Anwar al-Awlaki was. He was a Muslim cleric in Yemen, and the U.S. government had said he was responsible for influencing the Fort Hood shooter, the unsuccessful Christmas Day underwear bomber, as well as the failed Times Square bomber. On September 30th of this year, al-Awlaki was killed by drone strike. Now, what is critical to this story is that al-Awlaki was a U.S. citizen born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. 2 weeks after his assassination, a separate drone attack was used to kill his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. The 16-year-old was at a family barbecue. He was also a U.S. citizen born in Denver. So the question:
as President of the United States, would you sign that death warrant for an American citizen overseas who you believe is a terrorist suspect?
Well, he's not a terrorist suspect. He's a person who was found guilty under review of actively seeking the death of Americans.
Not found guilty by a court, sir.
He was found guilty by a panel that looked at it and reported to the president.
But that is not true, at least not to the extent that has been either made public by the administration or in the context of leaked information. Here's what we do know. There was not a panel that determined al-Awlaki's guilt. There is a roughly 50-page memorandum by the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. It was completed around June of 2010. And that memo was written not by a panel, but by two lawyers, David Barron and Martin Lederman. The legal analysis that those two lawyers provided concluded that al-Awlaki could be legally killed if it was not feasible to capture him, because intelligence agencies said he was taking part in the war between the United States and al-Qaeda and posed a significant threat to Americans. So on that first issue, there was not a legal panel that determined he could be killed, just two lawyers. But there's more. The memorandum written by those two lawyers was written more than a year before al-Awlaki was killed. Now, according to the Washington Post, who was leaked the memo, it did not independently analyze the quality of the evidence against him. The Post goes on to say there is no evidence that a review took place that found him guilty in any meaningful, constitutional, or legal sense. So here's what you need to know. Even if Gingrich had been right, and he wasn't, there are a lot of Americans who would say he was still wrong because the Constitution does not grant the president the authority to assassinate any citizen. The Constitution, however, does deal with this issue. Citizens who wage war against the nation, it's called treason. It carries a death penalty. But Article 3 of the Constitution states that no person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession. And by the way, all of that happens in open court. And that is Reality Check.
As Ben mentioned, this was part one of Reality Check. Tomorrow he's going to look at whether or not Gingrich's overall positions on the power of the president to assassinate are accurate as a matter of law. And you can comment on tonight's story. Just head over to Ben's Facebook page. Just search Ben Swan, WXIX. Last night we told you about comments during the CBS debate by former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. Gingrich stated that as president, he would sign a death warrant for U.S. citizens who were suspected terrorists. But his answer included legal reasoning for why terror suspects, even U.S. citizens, are not protected by the Constitution. Ben's looking at the second part of this issue in tonight's Reality Check.
Well, during that Republican debate, Gingrich explained that many Americans are confused over this issue and that rule of law protects the decision by the president to assassinate certain citizens without due process. When the moderator, Scott Pelley, pressed him on the issue, here's what Gingrich said.
Well, that's extrajudicial. It's not the rule of law.
It is the rule of law. That is explicitly false. It is the rule of law. No. If you engage in war against the United States, you are an enemy combatant. You have none of the civil liberties in the United States. You cannot go to court.
Well, the crowd liked the answer, but it is not true. When the Bush administration first started using the term enemy combatant, they substituted that term for what the Geneva Convention refers to as unlawful combatants. A captured fighter in a war who is not entitled to prisoner of war status because he or she does not meet the definition of a lawful combatant as established by the Geneva Convention. And that means that these are fighters who don't wear uniforms and don't fight under a single nation's flag. The Council on Foreign Relations stated in 2001, the President has unquestioned authority to detain enemy combatants, including those who are U.S. citizens during wartime. But what Gingrich failed to recognize is that the Supreme Court has since ruled on this issue. It was in 2004 that the High Court ruled that the Bush administration could no longer hold detainees indefinitely without allowing them to challenge their detention. Gingrich says the terror suspects can't even go to court. But the Supreme Court ruled that even foreign fighters being held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, who were not U.S. citizens, had the right to challenge in U.S. civilian courts the government's right to hold them. Now, there's one more statement to look at.
There's a huge gap here that frankly, far too many people get confused over. Civil defense, criminal defense, is a function of being within the American law. Waging war on the United States is outside criminal law. It is an act of war and should be dealt with as an act of war, and the correct thing in an act of war is to kill people who are trying to kill you.
But that is not entirely true either. In 2007, the Supreme Court ruled that all terror suspects, regardless of enemy combatant status, must be treated under the authority of the Third Geneva Convention. Under Article 5 of that Third Convention, unlawful combatants, such as mercenaries and members of armed forces who do not fulfill the conditions of a lawful combatant, can be subject to the death penalty. But no punishment is to be imposed without all the regular judicial guarantees and a fair trial before a properly constituted court. So here's what you need to know. Again, in Tuesday night's CNN debate, many of the candidates kept going back to this idea that in order to confront the war on terror, constitutional protections and rules have to change. Because our founders, they claim, never imagined an enemy like we face today. A remarkable position in the Republican debate, considering the platform on almost every other issue that we have to return to the authority of the Constitution. In fact, on that entire stage, only one candidate says we can fight the war on terror and abide by the Constitution. Texas Congressman Ron Paul. So what say you? That is Reality Check.
If you'd like to make your voice heard on this story, you can do so by commenting on Ben's Facebook page. All you have to do is search Ben Swann, WXIS.